Hello and welcome. It's another Confessions podcast. That's what this is, an audio array of terrible tales from the sinful Radio 2 listeners. This week's concise collection includes a wicked weedy wheeze, a clumsy canoeing catastrophe, a messy mosh mishap, and a bursting boot brouhaha. Very good, excellent alliteration. Let's see about the confessions. This is BBC Radio 2. Here's another Drive Time Confession. The collective are herein assembled. You can send in your confession via the website, or you can email it to confessions@bbc.co.uk. The Confessions podcast is there. The whole of last week, all you have to do is just download it, bbc.co.uk/radio2, or iTunes, or one of those places. Dear Father Simon in the Holy Order, this one comes from Debbie, by the way. Hello, Debbie. My confession took place in 1979, when I was 18, and quite lazy, and decided to get a part-time holiday job at a local organisation called the Weed Research Council.
Wow.
I wonder what they do. Anyway, actually, it would be more accurate to say my mum decided that I was going to get a part-time holiday job at a local organisation called the Weed Research Council, because according to her, I was enjoying the benefits of home life whilst contributing absolutely nothing to the housekeeping pot, and I needed to grow up and live in the real world. Anyway, whatever, says Debbie.
Okay.
Debbie immediately just stepping back into that teenage role, somehow instinctively. So I was duly signed up and presented myself ready and willing, or sullen and resentful to be more accurate, for work the following Monday. I had no idea what to expect, but perhaps there was a clue in the name of the organisation. I was introduced to a professor and told I was to be his assistant for 5 hours a day for the next 3 weeks. To say that he was the human form of beige would be an insult to all things beige. Not only that, but it appeared that he suffered from extreme shyness as he blushed and stuttered and avoided all eye contact. I know just how he felt, because I too suffer with extreme and painful shyness. What a pair we were.
Brilliant,
says Debbie. Excruciating doesn't begin to describe the long walk from his office to a nearby field, side by side, in the most awkward of silences. After what seemed like 10 miles, but was probably no more than 100 yards, we stopped, and he placed on the ground a grid that he'd been carrying. It was about a yard square with lots of little squares dividing it up. He then explained, as we both stood there blushing and avoiding any eye contact at all, that we would be counting the weeds within the grid. Him on his side and me on my side.
This is perfect.
Noting down the number of weeds in each little square and their height. Oh my, how riveting it was. You can just... I'm just there with them. See?
5 weeks of this. Here it comes.
About 20 years later... Actually, it was just 5 hours. I have no idea how I survived the tortuous ordeal. There are no words that could describe the mind-numbing boredom of counting weeds. Not to mention our crippling shyness that took feeling uncomfortable to a whole new level. Of course, I thought my mum would be sympathetic to my awful plight. Alas, no. With cries of, "If you loved me, you wouldn't make me do this," I dragged my lead-laden body back to the Weed Research Council for day 2 of coma-inducing weed counting with Professor Beige. Ditto day 3. And day 4. And day 5. Now, the following Monday, I decided no matter what, I would not, under any circumstances, be returning to endure any more of Professor Beige's weed counting or our mutual toe-curling shyness. No way, not a chance, not going back, never. So my mum and I were in the middle of what you might call a flaming argument about it when there was a knock on the door. Horrifyingly, it was Professor Beige at my house, blushing and stuttering that he had to go up north for a couple of weeks, and would I continue to count and measure the weeds' progress on my own. He handed me the grid and his notebook where all the data thus far had been recorded. And so at last I was beginning to see a glimmer of hope. Blushing and stuttering in return, I confirmed absolutely yes, of course I would do precisely what he wanted. I felt like I'd been reborn. And so, Father Simon, I'm not in the least bit ashamed to say I spent the next 2 weeks relaxing on my bed, enjoying episodes of Champion the Wonder Horse on my black and white portable television. Oh, yeah. And at some point, I scribbled down a few random numbers in the professor's notebook. I made up pages and pages of research, graphs showing extraordinary weed growth, followed by catastrophic weed loss. I drew pictures of new weeds that I'd seen, most of which were based on images of Peter Powell's hair. As he'd been on Top of the Pops that week. I never went back to the weed site, not once, but you would never have known it. I filled in PhD levels of research and used as many Latin names that I could find in my dad's dictionary. So, now is the time to seek forgiveness for filling in Professor Beige, Professor Beige's sheets with complete fiction, which probably had him scratching his head in confusion, trying to make any sense of the apparent chaotic weed growth that occurred during his absence. He must have realised that either A, I was useless and a cheat, or B, he had missed the most extraordinary week of weed activity since the end of the Neolithic era. It's probably A, but he was too shy to come round and tell me. I also seek forgiveness from my mum, who until this day has no idea that I used to sneak back home after she left for work when she thought I was out counting weeds. See, the summer jobs does provide you with a whole... I said I was a paddling pool attendant. But weed counting, you can imagine... Well, you know, it's a job. I don't know. Debbie doesn't mention whether she's getting any pay for this. See? So I'm not at all sure that she's going to get forgiven. But anyway, she had a job at the Weed Research Council, and she fooled Professor Beige into thinking she'd done some research when actually she had done no such thing. What do you think, Rebecca?
Well, you know, this research could have been used for the weed killing industry, couldn't it? And it may be the reason that for anyone listening whose weeds continue to grow despite them using weed killing. It's all Debbie's fault, but it's probably not the case. I think, well, she could have left the job. She could have just left the job if she hated it that much. But I think her description of the weed counting with Mr. Beige and the excruciating silence is so good, and I can so imagine it. And it must have been so awful for Debbie that I'm going to forgive you.
All right, Debbie's 1 out of 1. What do you think, Matt?
Well, we've all had summer jobs that we didn't like or we had to endure. I had to work in a garden centre and I hated it, and I lasted about a week. And so I can absolutely empathise with someone who's doing a job that they don't want to do. Oh, incidentally, though, I'd have loved to have seen the job advert for this particular one. Must be able to endure awkward silences on the way to and from fields. Must be able to count. Find weeds in a grid.
Yeah.
All pretty dull. I love the fact that she based them on Peter Powell's hair. I think that's... In fact, she's done an enormous amount of work on this. And probably more work than if she'd actually gone to the field. So, in that case, I am going to forgive. Because, you know, Professor Beige, it was the highlight of his summer, no doubt.
So here's tonight's confession. It comes from Steve. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Dear Simon and the lovely, lovely collective. My confession harks back many years to an incident that happened in the south of France. There is a beautiful gorge where many school groups visit, as well as members of the general public, to descend the river some 30 kilometres in canoes. It's a canoeing confession, because you might have realised. Obviously, these school groups require experienced canoeists to support and guide them down the river over several days, and it was in this position that I was once gainfully employed. As the descent was so long, it necessitated a 2-day descent, which included a night sleeping out in the open at a large bivouac site, with both the children and the staff taking everything they required, including dried food, large pans, gas bottles and cast iron burners. The canoeing staff team usually took it in turns to be the food boat, which involved a canoe being loaded up with all the gubbins for cooking the tea and breakfast, and that member of staff was responsible for feeding the entire group for the 2-day descent. This is obviously not a task that any of us jumped at, and we all did our very best to avoid it. Well, you've guessed it, I was the cooking boat on this particular excursion. So was duly loaded up with all the cooking paraphernalia. 2 very large pans, 2 cast iron burners, big and heavy, a large gas bottle, various ladles and stirry things, a large water container, dried food and rice. This is a heavy boat. 15 litres of red wine, 60 or 70 pain au chocolat, and 20 to 30 baguettes, which would become very flat and chewy eventually. These boats were large fiberglass Canadian canoes with which you could take an awful lot of kit. The only bonus to being the cooking boat was that you're able to leave the main group at lunchtime in order to paddle ahead to the site, unload the boat and get the tea cooking, as it would take hours to heat up the water for all the dried food. And this is where my confession begins. The heat of the south of France in the summer is glorious, and most sensibly retire for a lengthy lunch in the shade for an hour, but the cooking boat has to paddle on, and the male canoeists on the staff team usually use this quiet piece of solitude to, shall we say, develop an all-over tan.
Right. Right.
So we have now, paragraph 4, got to the heart of it.
I see.
The gorge was also known for occasional strong gusts of wind, known as the sirocco, so our shorts were usually stowed in the barrel to stop them blowing into the river. I was paddling blissfully and calmly down the river, revelling in the peace and beauty of what is a truly magnificent natural wonder. 1,000-foot limestone cliffs rising... get on with it. Deserted rapids for me... Oh, yes, OK. With just the occasional fish leaping out of the river and deserted rapids for me to power down with nothing to hold me up or slow me down. As I rounded one corner, heading towards a large rapid, I noticed a group of people standing on the river beach, looking at something. But due to the white water, I was unable to see precisely what they were looking at. Now I was faced with several options. One, to try and stop my boat and put my shorts on to see what was happening, but I would have arrived on the beach very close to them. 2, stand up in my boat, moving toward them at some speed, trying to get my shorts out of the barrel and put them on in a moving boat heading toward a rapid. Maybe not. Or 3, just paddle on through the rapid as though nothing was happening, as fast as I could, crossing my fingers and everything else that they would not notice. After what seemed like quite some time running the options through my mind, I decided on option 3 and went full steam ahead. If I hadn't been naked, I would have stopped. I would like you to know that. What would you have done? Says Steve. When I reached the mouth of the rapid, I discovered what they were looking at. It was a member of staff from a rival company, surfing in the rapid, facing his boat upstream and playing on the standing waves present in the rapid, clearly showing off, actually, and trying to impress the large group of people standing on the beach watching. This was no big deal, as the rapid was quite wide, and all I needed to do was zip past and hope that he continued to provide the fascinating entertainment that would distract them from my somewhat exposed presentation. Unfortunately, this canoeist was not as proficient as he was leading his audience to believe, and seeing my fully laden 17-foot cooking boat steaming towards him, lost control of his boat, which went sideways across the river. He had no option but to jump out of his boat with a terrified shout, whilst the bow of my boat smashed through the gunwales of his fiberglass boat, breaking it virtually in two, whilst I paddled on down the rapid, head down, not looking back, but hearing the entertaining roar of hoots and guffaws from the onlookers. Father Simon, I didn't stop, but I did look back to see him stranded on one side of the river, trying desperately to rescue the shattered remains of his boat and get it to the beach on the other side. I thought briefly about helping, but decided on putting as much distance between me and them as quickly as I could. This was the talk of the river for quite some time afterwards, I can tell you, and I prudently kept my head down until the story faded away. I've kept this very quiet to this day, but feel that enough water has passed, if you pardon the pun, to try and seek forgiveness for this unfortunate incident. I need forgiveness from the poor paddler whose boat I destroyed. It was my naturist tendency that caused me to act as I did, and if I had been clothed appropriately, I would have appreciated what was coming down the track and acted more appropriately. I never canoed starkers again. Well, Steve learnt the error of his ways, but it's an issue, isn't it? If you can imagine, if you're in the canoe, it's fully laden, you're not wearing anything. Do you stop? Do you power on through? Rebecca, what would...
I really don't get the appeal of the wanting an all-over tan. Don't get that at all.
Okay.
I also think that...
Some people
I just can't believe that these people laughed at the, the poor bloke who had his boat.
I think it was probably because he was showing off, and he was fine.
Yeah, but, I mean, he could have been hurt. They were laughing and guffawing at the fact that his boat had broken in half.
I don't think they were laughing at that point. They were laughing at how he was doing the surfing, and then there was the crash.
Anyway, so this bloke, Steve, was canoeing dangerously because he didn't have any shorts on. I think if he was going to do that, he should have at least worn a sarong or something that he could have thrown on in case danger.
A sarong?
I mean, what if something really what if suddenly, someone had needed rescuing and he couldn't rescue them because he was, starkers. So I think for all those reasons, I'm not going to forgive you.
You'd have thought he could have used a baguette or something. Just he's got 30 of them there. Come on.
A pan au chocolat. Now then, I'm not of the naturist tendency myself.
You're all over tan?
No, but, if you're going to do it, then you're going to do it. And it doesn't matter whether people are going to see you. If that's what floats your boat, as it were, then you've got to carry through with it. And if that means you're going to rescue some bloke who you've just hit with your boat because he was showing off in front of his mate, then that's what you're going to have to do. There's no point in doing I'm going to get the all-over tan. Look at me pushing the edge of society. No, you're not. All you're doing is taking your shorts off on a canoe. And if you're prepared to do that, you should be prepared to jump into the river and save your man with the surfing.
You think?
Yes. Not living on the edge of society at all, as it turns out.
So it's Radio 2 here. It's Drive Time, and we have another Drive Time confession. This one comes from Jane. You'll have noticed that the Dean of Deadliness has
I slipped in quietly there. Did you notice that?
First appearance of the week. We also noticed that.
All right.
Dear Father Simon and the Forgiving Collective, I write to beg forgiveness for a terrible event which occurred in my formative years. My confession involves a popular music band and a particular song from the late 80s which you played recently on your show. I recognised that when you played this song, it was a sign. It was a sign from above, a sign of encouragement for me to finally offload my shame and regret. My shameful event occurred in the early 90s during my student years. While normally being of a studious nature, working hard for my teaching qualification, I did on occasion enjoy the odd night out and some male company to break the routine of lectures, course projects and exams. Taking a break from my studies, I was lucky enough to secure some concert tickets to see the big band at the time, Manchester favourites James. The tickets were a gift from my new boyfriend Des. We'd been together a few months and this was our first concert together. The venue was the Glasgow Barrowlands Ballroom. James were very much at the height of their fame, and in Scotland, Barrowlands the place to see any act, with its specially sprung dance floor, which would bounce along with the crowd, and the excellent acoustics, which made for a great concert atmosphere. With such a big night ahead and the likelihood that a few drinks would be had, I took the sensible option of having a big dinner, just to line my stomach and hopefully prevent too much impact from the alcohol. By the way, I should have said at the beginning of this confession,
yes,
if you're eating, there might be a challenge. There might be a challenge involved in actually getting through to the end of your meal.
I felt sick already.
Forewarned. Being a student of limited budget and culinary skills, a big meal meant a baked potato, tuna, and extra flourish of sweet corn. A tour of the bars around Glasgow preceded our arrival at Barrowlands. Despite having had quite a few drinks, I still had the good sense to grab a bag of chips just to keep me nourished before we entered. The chippy would be mobbed when we came out, and we needed to rush for the train after the show. I needed something to soak it all up and minimise the potential for a hangover. When we entered Barrowlands, the place was buzzing, jam-packed with lager-fuelled teens ready for a rocking night. The mosh pit was the only place for me. Dr. Mosh would have been proud of my spirit.
Hey!
Dr. Mosh is on later, of course. The band arrived on stage to rapturous reception and the gig kicked off. They ran through their repertoire. The crowd absolutely loved it. The sprung dance floor seemed to defy gravity and the laws of physics, and we all bounced and swayed along to each song. The songs rang out. She's a Star, Born of Frustration, all the hits, the music, the lights, the crowd. This was the best concert I'd ever been to. As the crowd got further into the moment, the pushing, the swaying, the jumping seemed to increase in intensity. At first it was thrilling, then excess adrenaline seemed to kick in. I started to come over a little bit woozy.
Oh no.
This feeling grew and I was now starting to feel a little faint. The wise thing to do is to stand still, hold on tight to Des, gather my senses and take deep breaths. This seemed to work initially, but then I could feel the sickness rise in my stomach, and standing in the middle of the mosh pit, I knew what was about to arrive.
Oh no!
I've cut out the next paragraph.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for that.
Well, Father Simon, the feeling didn't pass, and you can guess the rest. A few more lines I missed out there.
Yes.
However, the crowd were still bouncing away, oblivious to my unfortunate state, and also oblivious to the fact that their baggy jeans and suede boots were now decorated in a whole new way.
No.
Pebble dashed, I say. To seek forgiveness at this stage would seem a reasonable thing, but it didn't end there. My flight reflex kicked in, and I knew the right thing to do was to evacuate from the area and hope nobody noticed what had happened. Or, yes, evacuate.
We need evacuate.
Or at least who the culprit was. As I pushed my way out of the mosh pit towards the exit and the fresh air, the band finished their song, the crowd cheered and relaxed. What happened next could not have been more badly timed. As I moved out of the mosh pit, I heard the band strike up with the opening line, "Sing myself to sleep."
Oh, no!
The next song was Sit Down. As all good James fans know, one of the main crowd pleasers and community building moments is their big hit, Sit Down. The normal protocol for the crowd is to do as the band suggest and sit down. Well, you can imagine the next few minutes of mayhem which took place. Father Simon, I do beg forgiveness, and there is a long list. Here we go.
Right.
I beg forgiveness for the poor souls who sat down in a large patch which I had provided across the mosh pit. I beg forgiveness from the security staff who mistook the commotion as some kind of fight and moved into the mosh pit to intervene, only to slip and slide, a bit like the Keystone Cops. I beg forgiveness to the crowds of people queuing at the toilets while furious girls and boys tried to clean their hands and jeans in the toilet facilities while they're desperate for a wee. I beg forgiveness from the mothers and some fathers who were faced with cleaning the clothes of their kids the next morning whilst disbelieving the explanation of what had happened. I beg forgiveness from Des, who had bought the tickets on a limited budget but ended up the night with an embarrassment of a date. I beg forgiveness from the James fans, who will feel a bit queasy next time they hear Sit Down, especially at a concert. I beg forgiveness from the listeners to your great show who are sitting down to dinner at this time. And, of course, I beg forgiveness from James, a great band who, during their great concert, were faced with half an audience sitting down for their main crowd pleaser, and the other half caught up in a commotion of vomit and confusion. Normally these stories have a romantic ending, says Jane. After many decades, Des and I are still happily married, that kind of thing. Oh. However, this is not the case, and he dumped me a few weeks later, stating irreconcilable differences or some such nonsense. Anyway,
well,
Jane,
there we go.
It was, it's nicely told, and she went to see James, and they sat down, but she'd lined her stomach, but the lining didn't last. No. She has so many people who need to forgive her. Let's see how she does with Sister Rebecca.
Being sensible, wasn't she, trying to line her stomach? I mean, that was actually the responsible thing to do, because if she hadn't, it may have been even worse. And it's really bad luck that particular song came along and everyone sat down. I mean, how many bands are there where the audience actually has to sit down during one of their songs? I mean, probably just James.
They just didn't know what they were sitting in.
Yeah, no. I just don't think it would have made any difference. I mean, she ran away, which is a bit cowardly of her, but would it have made any difference if she told the individuals, actually, that was me, whose vomit you're sitting in, my vomit you're sitting in? Jane, you are forgiven.
Forgiven, OK, excellent. Let's see what the Dean of Deadliness...
Yeah, I think forgive. It's 20-odd years ago. And it was an accident. You didn't mean to do it, and as Rebecca said, you did the lining of the stomach for all the right reasons. So I think forgiven.
OK, so it's a mosh pit confession,
yes,
Dr. Much.
Here's my problem with this, is that I much as I'm a big fan of James and all their work, Come Home, Born of Frustration, all very good tracks, sometimes. That said, I have a massive problem with Sit Down, and in fact I have a bigger problem with people who sit down during a concert. Because look at me, I'm sitting down on the floor, thumbing my nose at convention when everyone else is standing up. Look at me, counterculture, blah blah blah. Well, I say no, and you got what you deserved. Quite right, you've got that all over your pants. How much of a thumbing nose at convention do you feel like now? Not very much, I would say.
I have to share an office with this man.
Yes, and I say for that reason, definitely forgiven. They had it coming.
Starring Idris Elba, who is in Pacific Rim.
And The Wire.
And The Wire. But in the big movie world of cinema, he's in Pacific Rim. He's like main guy behind the aliens and the robots.
So you've seen it already, and it only comes out tomorrow. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay.
Just showing off, Simon, aren't you?
Well done.
Just thought I'd mention it.
He works on a film show.
Yeah.
And Guillermo del Toro
is
on the movie show tomorrow.
Oh, really?
No, he's a movie director. Anyway, stop it. I'm trying to concentrate on tonight's tale. Novice Nige is with us. Father Simon and the hallowed brethren and sisterhood, I seek forgiveness for a psychological burden. Oh, this is from Scott, by the way. I've carried around for more than 30 years. What I'm about to reveal took place after the Falklands conflict in 1982. Aboard one of Her Majesty's ships, I was fortunate to be a member of the Middle Management, formerly referred to as the Warrant and Chief Petty Officers Mess. Once the war in the South Atlantic was officially over, the Royal Navy had to maintain a presence, waiting for the new airfield runway to be completed. Eventually, the day dawned when the RAF Phantom fighters arrived at their brand new airbase, and all the ships on station could return home. When we started the homeward voyage, another of Her Majesty's ships accompanied us all the way to Gibraltar and berthed just behind us. Being a fun-loving bunch, we extended an invitation to our equivalents in the other visiting ship. As is the tradition, having extended the invitation, we were the hosts, and so duly set about ensuring the appropriate hospitality was in abundance, meaning canapes and a good supply of lemonade, is what we're calling it. It can be anything you like. Why are you looking blankly
Well,
at me?
we've never shirked from saying alcohol before, have we?
I'm just saying this is the language that Scott is using. I'm imagining that it's a metaphor for booze.
On a Majesty's vessel. Obviously, it's like the rum ration.
Maybe it's rum, yeah. About 5 minutes before the first guests were due to arrive, I was dispatched to the galley to collect some trays of cheese and pineapple chunks. Astute, thirsty listeners will have noticed more food being included at this point, just because Nigel's here. Hey. Approaching the lounge, I reached for the door handle when suddenly it was flung open, knocking the entire contents of the trays I was carrying right out of my hands. Chunks of cheddar cheese and tarty pineapple were scattered across the deck. I looked up in pained surprise to see Daft Dan, a gangling engine room techie who was always at the root of most mishaps. Daft Dan merely shrugged and sloped off to his next potential disaster. But what was I to do? There was no time to mop, sweep, or properly clean up the deck. So my razor-sharp reactions kicked in, and I quickly decided to use the discarded boots of our engine room staff, neatly lined up against the adjacent wall, in which to deposit the aforementioned scattered cheese and pineapple. Glimpsing a large pair of these service-issued boots adorned, for some reason, with red laces, I managed to cram the entire contents of scattered cheese and pineapple into this one particular pair. I was truly amazed at how many chunks of cheese and pineapple could be crammed into a pair of size 11s. Grabbing a handkerchief from my pocket, I quickly managed to mop up the immediate area to avoid any guests slipping and sliding as they entered the lounge. Thinking no more about this, I joined in the lunchtime social. Suffice to say, it was a rip-roaring success and proved to be the start of 4 lost days. I did, however, remember someone telling me... Yeah. 4? That's unbelievable.
Wow. It wasn't over captain.
All down to lemonade.
Yeah, who'd have thought? Yes, I did, however, remember someone telling me, I think, over far too many beers, during one of the days we were alongside, that our mess president, we'll call him Mr. B, a strapping Australian and key figure in the engine room, laced his service-issued boots with red laces, and for good reason. If he was called to the engine room urgently, he could immediately identify his boots, grab them, and quickly put them on. Well, the day arrived when we set sail from Gibraltar for our home base at Plymouth. Shortly after leaving, and still at my official post on the bridge, I was mildly surprised to be told that our illustrious mess president wished to address all of the members during the morning coffee break. Usually during the first day out from any visit, this was a chance to compare notes and learn of any outlandish escapades that we got up to. When everyone was assembled, Mr. B, renowned for his very short Aussie temper, announced in a very loud voice... Oh, dear.
Here we go.
On his way to the engine room.
Yeah. Oh, I'm annoyed.
I took my flaming boots off, and struth, my socks were covered in cheese and pineapple chunks. How did I do?
That's very good.
Michael Caine.
Was it?
The Italian job, that's what that was.
As a result, he had been attending, apparently, to his very important naval duties in his stocking feet, pit-pattering around the ship, leaving squished pineapple-infused footprints, when a visiting admiral had nosed around and inspected his particular area of expertise. And the admiral had been horrified by the slovenly standards of the Navy, and Mr. B had got, as we say in the Navy, a right old telling off. He went on, increasing the decibel level of his voice. Who knows something
Oh, dear.
Who knows something about it, he shouted with his Aussie accent ways.
Yeah.
Come on, somebody fess up. What are you saying?
Yeah. Right.
The ensuing moment was frozen in time. Nobody uttered a word. Everyone simply stared straight ahead, except for one of the assembled called Jumping Jay, who burst forth with a belly laugh that eclipsed the laughing policeman. Jumping was one of the mess characters, bearing a remarkable resemblance to Bobby Ball. Jumping was stood right beside me, and I froze and remained impassive. With obvious relief, all assembled automatically assumed that Jumping had been up to his old tricks and had filled Mr. B's size 11s with the aforementioned cheese and pineapple chunks. Jumping, I'm afraid to say, was sent to the brig. How about that? Goes to prison on ship.
Oh, dear.
To this day, both Mr. B and Jumpin are unaware that it was me who stuffed the pineapple and sweaty cheese into the service-issued leather boots adorned with red laces. So obviously forgiveness for unwittingly dropping one of my very dear shipmates in the brig, and for causing Mr. B's delay in starting the ship's engines whilst he was drying his feet and donning clean socks. Well, you know, he was trying to be creative, but I suppose that could have been disastrous, and so it turned out for Jumpin' Jay, who ended up in prison. A shocking end, I think. What do you think there? Sister Rebecca.
Well, I mean, obviously you can say he didn't intend to drop the chunks all over the floor and everything. He could have just found a bin or a bag or done... I mean, he could have been a little bit more creative.
Chuck him overboard.
Chuck him overboard, chuck him anywhere, just not the president of the mess president's boots. And I think the fact that... the colleague then did he actually did he claim he'd done it anyway?
He laughed so much, like he did a Matt, and then he laughed so much.
That was the implication. Yeah, the fact that he didn't at that point, that Scott didn't at that point say it was him, I think is really quite low. Yeah, so sorry, Scott, you're not forgiven.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, let's take Novice Nige.
Pretty Officer Scott, you are a plonker, Rodney. That's terrible. I mean, and also there was a moment when someone had been talking about the fact that the Australian mess president lashed his boots up with red laces. So he should have had an opportunity to think, I must take the cheese and cheesy pineapple chunks. And also, what about the 3-second rule on the ship? Get him back on the plate. Get them served up.
We have established on homework recently that doesn't count. The 5, 10, whatever second rule doesn't work. Once it's on the floor, it's on the floor.
Of course. This is coming from the chef, by the way.
Well,
put it back on the
Matt,
plate.
you've got to build up your antibodies. Children have got to go and play with soil. Of course they have. It's part of growing up. No, I mean, also... And then when Jumping Jay obviously had one of his attacks and jumped up, he didn't even come to his aid then. No, that's really poor. That's just really poor. So I'm definitely not forgiving you.
Not forgiving Scott. It's not looking good. Let's see how Brother Matt takes it.
Well, here's the thing with Jumping Jay, the character on board ship. Yeah, and despite the fact that I love the fact that he's being compared to Bobby Ball, too few references to Bobby Ball on in Confessions for my money. Frankly, if you are a character and you like all the japes and all that, it's always going to come back and bite you. And it may not be for something that you've done. It may just be something you didn't do, and that's what's happened this time. But it was coming anyway. So he was going to spend some time in the brig, and it was probably going to be for something he had done, but it turned out something he hadn't done. So I am going to forgive, because he had it coming.
Just a weird logic you've got
Very weird.
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about Daft Dan? He should have gone to the brig as well for not helping.
You're just sending everyone to the brig again, Nige.
Apart from,
Take it to the brig.
Yeah, apart from Jumping Jay.
Well, that was it, and very good, I thought, this week. Let us know yours, please, and we all know you've got hundreds. confessions@bbc.co.uk. That's our email. We'll have more for you next week. Don't forget to download the Weekly Mayo, because that's fun too. Available now and every Thursday. Thank you.